The night was still. A heavy silence lay across the Mississippi plantation, broken only by the restless chirping of crickets and the groaning of old wooden beams inside the great house. No one suspected that by dawn, this mansion, a monument to wealth built on human suffering, would be nothing more than a smoldering ruin. History remembers wars and presidents. It remembers laws and treaties, victories and defeats, but it rarely remembers the quiet acts of defiance, the single spark that sets a world aflame. This is one of those forgotten stories, a story of a woman whose name may never be known, but whose act of resistance burned brighter than the grandest chandelier in her master's hall. For her, life had never been her own. Every breath, every step, every word was watched, commanded, and controlled. By day, she labored in the kitchen, preparing lavish meals for a family that saw her only as property. By night, she lay on a straw mat, her body aching, her spirit caged. She had no papers, no freedom, no promise of tomorrow. And yet she carried something no master could chain: the memory of freedom whispered in her blood, and the fire of dignity that refused to die. On that fateful night, something inside her broke, or perhaps something inside her finally awakened. She had seen too much cruelty, felt too much pain, and endured too much silence. The whip had scarred her back. The screams of other women had scarred her soul. The mansion stood as a symbol of every humiliation, every theft of humanity, every tear shed in darkness, and she would no longer allow it to stand. She walked into the kitchen as she had done countless times before, but this time, the fire she tended was not to cook another feast. This time, the flames were hers to command. She gathered the kindling, the oil, the scraps of cloth, and fed the blaze. The fire began as a whisper, then roared into a scream, leaping from timber to timber, devouring the house that had devoured so many lives. The family awoke to chaos, choking smoke, cracking wood, the thunder of collapsing beams. Some escaped, others did not. But in the shadows beyond the fire, a group of enslaved souls ran for the swamps, guided by the woman whose hands still smelled of smoke and courage. Her story was never written in the books. The newspapers of the time called it an accident. The masters wanted silence, not legend. But among the quarters, among the broken yet unbowed, whispers of her deeds spread like embers on the wind. They called her the woman who burned the mansion, the woman who turned fear into fire, the woman who reminded them that even in chains, resistance could blaze. This is not just the story of one night. It is the story of centuries of oppression meeting the courage of one heart. It is the story of how fire can purify as much as it destroys. And it is a story that asks us, even now, a haunting question. When the world builds its house upon your suffering, do you endure in silence, or do you light the match? To understand the fire, we must first understand the world that built the house. The South in the late 19th century was a land-divided fields of wealth stretching endlessly, and quarters of misery hidden just beyond the view of polished windows. Plantations rose like kingdoms, and their masters believed themselves to be kings. But the truth was darker. Every brick of those mansions was mortared with suffering. Every golden cup in their dining rooms was paid for by the backs of enslaved men, women, and children. In the daylight, the plantation appeared serene. Cotton swayed gently in the wind. Carriages moved along dirt roads, and the air was filled with the sounds of cicadas. But beneath that calm lay a system of cruelty so deep it poisoned every breath. For the enslaved, the plantation was a prison without walls. They were not counted as people, only as property, listed alongside livestock and furniture in the ledgers of their masters. The woman, at the center of our story, lived in such a world. She belonged to no one, yet was claimed by everyone. The law said she was 3/5 of a person, a number written into the nation's founding compromises. But to her master, she was not even that. She was labor, flesh, and silence. Her worth was measured in how many meals she cooked, how much linen she washed, how obediently she lowered her eyes. The plantation kitchen was her domain, but it was not hers by choice. The heat of the fire scorched her skin day after day as she prepared meals she would never taste. The aromas of roasted meat and sweet pies filled the halls above, while she and her fellow slaves ate scraps in the shadows. It was here that she learned patience, restraint, and the quiet skill of survival. It was also here that she learned fire, how it breathed, how it grew, how it consumed. What her master saw as a servant's chore, she came to understand as a silent teacher. Outside the mansion, life in the slave quarters was harsh and unforgiving. The cabins were little more than shacks of rough wood, often shared by multiple families. There was little warmth in winter, little comfort in summer, and no privacy at all. Yet, it was within those cramped walls that enslaved people preserved their humanity. They sang songs of sorrow and hope, whispered stories from Africa, and prayed to a God who promised justice, even when men denied it. It was in those nights of song and prayer that sparks of courage were passed from one generation to the next. The masters feared rebellion. They feared fire, poison, and flight. And so they ruled with the whip, the chain, and the noose. Patrols roamed the roads at night, hunting for runaways. Newspapers spread tales of harsh punishments to terrify the enslaved into obedience. Every act of kindness was rationed like water, meant to remind the enslaved that survival depended on pleasing those who owned them. But fear has a limit. Push a people too far, and fear gives way to desperation. Desperation gives way to anger, and anger, when pressed against the walls of injustice, becomes fire. The woman we follow knew this truth in her bones. She had seen lashes tear through skin until blood stained the dirt. She had seen mothers weep as their children were sold to distant states. She had seen friends vanish in the night, either to escape or to die by their master's hand. Each memory was a coal added to the furnace inside her heart. By the time she reached adulthood, she carried not only her own wounds, but the weight of countless others. The mansion itself became a symbol of that weight. Its grand staircase, polished floors, and chandeliers were not just decorations. They were monuments to theft, built with stolen labor, polished by stolen hands, lit by candles bought with stolen lives. Every time she scrubbed the floors, she saw her reflection in the waxed wood, and she knew that reflection was not free. Every time she carried platters of food into the dining hall, she felt the eyes of portraits painted in oils, watching her like silent judges. And every time her master raised his glass in laughter, she knew the wine he drank was sweeter only because it was pressed from her suffering. This was the world of contradiction, a world where Sunday sermons preached Christian love, yet Monday mornings brought whips cracking in the fields. A world where wealthy women wore silk gowns while the women who dressed them wore scars. A world where fire was meant only to warm the master's hearth, never to free the hands that fed it. And yet, even in this world, the enslaved found ways to resist. Some fled north, guided by stars and whispers of the Underground Railroad. Some broke tools, slowed their work, or feigned illness. Some sang songs whose verses carried coded messages of escape. Resistance was not always loud. Often, it was hidden, subtle, and silent. But every act was a refusal to surrender completely. The woman who would one night burn her master's mansion had already been resisting long before she touched the match. Every step she took with her head held high, every song she hummed under her breath, every prayer she whispered in the darkness, all were acts of rebellion. For in a world that demanded silence, to remember your own dignity was already an act of war. As years passed, the balance of power in the South began to tremble. The Civil War had ended, but the legacy of slavery had not. Freedom was promised, yet laws and terror replaced chains with shackles of another kind. Plantations still stood, masters still ruled, and women like her still cooked in kitchens where freedom was a word too dangerous to speak aloud. This was the stage upon which her story unfolded. A mansion built on pain, a world built on lies, and a fire waiting to be born. She was never meant to be remembered. The records of history do not speak her name. To the masters, She was only a number, a line in a ledger, another body counted among the property of the estate. But silence can hold its own kind of memory, and in that silence, her story has survived. A story pieced together not by books, but by whispers, not by portraits, but by fire. We can imagine the world through her eyes. Born into bondage, she never knew the feeling of freedom as a child. Her earliest memories were of labor, tiny hands carrying buckets of water, sweeping dirt floors, gathering scraps from the kitchen. By the time most children would be learning letters or chasing sunlight in a schoolyard, she had already learned the harsh rhythm of command. Faster, getter, obey. Yet even within that rhythm, the soul finds ways to dream. She would gaze at the sky when she carried laundry to dry, watching birds trace circles in the air. She would listen to elders in the quarters, tell stories of Africa, stories of ancestors who had lived free, whose spirits still walked beside them. She would close her eyes at night and imagine another world, where her hands were not blistered, where her body was not owned, where her breath belonged to her alone. As she grew older, her burdens grew heavier. By adolescence, she was placed in the kitchen full-time. It was a place of endless heat, where her body bent over flames from sunrise to sunset. She learned the measurements of recipes not by books but by memory, by taste, by instinct, roasting meats, kneading dough, stirring pots of stew that could feed dozens. And always, she did it without complaint, for complaint brought punishment. The kitchen was her cage, but also her classroom. She learned to watch without being seen, to move silently, listening to conversations that floated in from the dining hall. She learned the moods of her master when he was drunk, when he was cruel, when his rage was building. She learned the patterns of his wife, whose sharp tongue cut deeper than knives. And she learned the frailty of the mansion itself, where the timbers groaned, where the walls were dry with age, where fire could run wild if ever it was unleashed. But life in the kitchen was more than toil. It was danger. For women enslaved, the body was never safe. At night, when the house grew quiet, footsteps in the corridor could mean terror. A door opening without warning, a shadow in the candlelight, the voice of a master claiming what was never his to take. The law offered no protection. Her no meant nothing. Her silence was demanded. And yet, within her silence, a storm grew. This storm was not only born of cruelty, it was born of love too, of the love she had for those who suffered beside her. She had siblings in the quarters, perhaps children of her own. She saw their faces every day, marked by hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Each time the whip struck another, she flinched as if it struck her. Each time a mother wept for a child sold away, her heart split as though it were her child gone. Pain became communal, and love became a weapon, for when you love deeply, injustice becomes unbearable. She was quiet, but she was not weak. Other slaves whispered of her courage, though it was a courage hidden in plain sight. When someone collapsed in the fields, she snuck bread to them at night. When a child cried from hunger, she saved scraps from the kitchen. When spirits broke, she sang softly, a hymn rising in the dark. Her strength was not loud, but steady, the kind of strength that does not break but bends, and then rises again. Over time, however, the weight grew too heavy to bear. The lashes across her back, the insults thrown at her like stones, the endless days of servitude, all these pressed upon her soul. She began to see the mansion not as a home of grandeur, but as a tomb where freedom was buried alive, where dignity was suffocated, where hope itself was locked away. Every time she lit the kitchen fire, she saw it reflected in her own eyes, and she wondered, could this flame ever burn beyond the hearth? One night, sitting outside the quarters, she listened to the elders speak of justice. They spoke of Nat Turner, who had led a bloody revolt decades earlier. They spoke of Harriet Tubman, who had guided hundreds to freedom through the Underground Railroad. They spoke of unnamed heroes, men and women who had resisted, who had fought, who had refused to bow. And in their voices, she heard her own destiny calling. She knew the risk. Resistance was death. A whisper of disobedience could bring the lash, the chain, the noose. A single rumor of rebellion could bring soldiers storming into the quarters. To strike against the master was to strike against the entire system of terror that protected him. And yet, she also knew this. Silence was another kind of death. To endure without end was to die slowly, piece by piece, year by year. If her body was already marked for suffering, why not make that suffering mean something? Inside her grew a clarity. She was no longer afraid of dying. She was afraid only of dying unseen, unheard, forgotten. She was afraid her children, or the children she cared for, would inherit the same chains, the same silence, the same tomb. And so she began to plan. Her plan was not written on paper. It lived only in her mind, hidden like a seed in winter. She studied the rhythms of the household when the family dined, when they slept, when they entertained guests. She noted the weakness of the structure: dry timbers in the attic, cloth curtains that caught flame easily, barrels of oil stored near the kitchen. And she nurtured the fire in her heart, waiting for the night when courage and opportunity would finally meet. To those around her, she was the same as always: silent, obedient, invisible. But beneath the mask of servitude, her spirit burned hotter each day. Every insult fed it. Every lash sharpened it. Every injustice turned her heart into tinder, ready for the strike of the match. We may never know the exact words she whispered to herself on that night, but we can imagine. Perhaps she thought of freedom. Perhaps she thought of vengeance. Perhaps she thought of her children, and the children after them, who might one day walk without chains because she had dared to resist. Whatever her thoughts, her decision was clear. She would not leave this world quietly. And so, the woman who had spent her life feeding fire for others, who had tended flames only to warm the house of her master, prepared to release the fire that lived inside her, the fire that would consume not only wood and stone, but also the illusion of power her master believed eternal. This was the woman behind the fire, not a figure of myth, but flesh and blood, not a name in a history book, but a spirit carved by pain and polished by endurance. She was ordinary, and that made her extraordinary. She was unseen, and that made her dangerous. For when the world tries to erase a person, that person may rise in flames to be remembered forever. The day of the fire passed quietly, almost too quietly. The plantation stirred with the familiar rhythms of labor, the field hands bent beneath the sun, the stable boys hurried with reins and saddles, the women in the quarters washed and mended until their fingers ached. It was a day like countless others, marked by monotony. But for her, the air felt different. Every sound, every movement carried weight, as if the world itself were holding its breath. In the kitchen, she moved with practiced skill, the chopping of vegetables, the kneading of bread, the stirring of stews, all of it done with steady hands. To any observer, she appeared as she always did, silent, obedient, tireless. But inside, her thoughts blazed like hidden embers. For weeks she had studied this house, not as a servant but as a strategist. She knew the creak of every floorboard, the draft in every hall, the weakness in every beam. And she knew that tonight, when shadows thickened and laughter faded into sleep, the house would reveal its most fragile truth. It was mortal. The evening began with a feast. The master had guests from neighboring estates, men swollen with wealth and arrogance, women dripping with jewels that sparkled in the candlelight. The dining hall glowed with chandeliers, the table heavy with roasted meats, sugared cakes, and wine. She moved among them, carrying dishes, pouring glasses, keeping her gaze lowered. But her mind was elsewhere, counting moments, memorizing exits, watching how the flames from the candles danced against the curtains. The guests spoke of crops, of markets, of politics. They laughed about profits made from cotton, about rumors of uprisings crushed, about the foolishness of those who dared to resist. To them, the enslaved were invisible bodies to serve, shadows to obey, nothing more. And in their blindness, they never saw her listening. They never imagined that the woman who filled their glasses was measuring the perfect moment to burn their world to the ground. When the last dish was cleared and the carriages rattled away, silence crept over the house. The master retired to his chamber, his wife trailing behind. Children were tucked into beds beneath heavy quilts, their dreams undisturbed by the weight of the chains that fed their comfort. The grand house settled into slumber, every ember glowing faintly, every shadow deepening. In the kitchen, she remained awake. This was always her place to watch the hearth, to keep the coals alive until morning. But tonight, her vigil was different. Her pulse quickened as she opened the pantry, where rags and oil waited. She had prepared them earlier, hidden among sacks of flour and barrels of grain. Her hands worked methodically, soaking the cloths, twisting them tight. Her face was calm, though her heart thundered like a drum. It was not the recklessness of despair that guided her. It was purpose. Every insult, every lash, every night stolen from her body, they had all led to this. Every memory of mothers weeping, of friends disappearing, of songs sung in secret, all of them pressed together in her chest until they became fuel. She no longer asked whether she should act. The only question was how long she could wait before the flames demanded release. She paused, listening. The house breathed heavily in its sleep. The master's snores carried faintly through the floorboards. The wind rattled the shutters, but otherwise all was still. She closed her eyes and whispered something only she could hear, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a promise. Then she opened them again, sharper, clearer. The time had come. Before striking the first spark, she stepped into the courtyard and looked toward the quarters. Other slaves lay in restless sleep, unaware of what the night would bring. She felt a pang of love, fierce and protective. This act was not only for her, it was for them, for their children, for the generations who might one day walk free. If she burned, let her burn as a signal, a warning, a hope. She returned to the kitchen, the rags in her hand. The embers glowed faintly in the hearth. Small and waiting, she crouched, feeding them air until they flared. The flames rose, orange and hungry, catching quickly on the cloth she pressed near. The smell of smoke sharpened in the air. It was the first breath of the storm. Her heart beat hard against her ribs, but her hands were steady. This was not fear anymore, it was clarity. The mansion was no longer untouchable. It was wood, it was cloth, it was oil, it was mortal, and she was about to remind it of that truth. The calm was breaking. The storm was about to roar, and she, the woman who had spent her life feeding fire for others, was ready to claim it for herself. The first flames were small, almost delicate. They licked the edge of the cloth, curling it black, sending tendrils of smoke into the air. In the stillness of midnight, even the faint crackle seemed deafening. She crouched close, watching as the fire took its first breath, then its second, then a ravenous third. It was alive now, no longer a tool for cooking, no longer the master's possession. This was her fire, her ally, her act of defiance, made visible. The kitchen filled with smoke quickly. She knew the house was dry, the timbers old and thirsty. Flames leapt from the rags to the drapes, climbing with a speed that startled even her. The orange glow danced across the walls, casting monstrous shadows that stretched long and twisted. The great house, once a monument to wealth and pride, was already trembling under the hunger of fire. She moved swiftly, setting more flames before the household could wake. The pantry went up next, barrels of oil feeding the blaze with a roar. Then, the stairwell, where polished wood and velvet runners caught with frightening ease. Each fire was a strike, each strike a declaration. I will not die in silence. Upstairs, the first coughs began. Children stirred, confused by the acrid smoke seeping under their doors. The mistress awoke with a start, choking, shrieking her husband's name. The master staggered to his feet, shouting orders that dissolved into panic. The house, once his fortress, had turned traitor. The walls he trusted, the beams he boasted of, all of them now conspired against him. The woman did not linger to watch. She stepped outside into the night air, her chest heaving as the glow swelled behind her. For a moment, she stood still, feeling the heat on her back. It was as though every lash, every insult, every stolen moment of her life had risen in these flames. Her pain was now their destruction. Inside, chaos consumed the halls. Servants screamed as they ran through choking smoke. Children cried, stumbling in confusion. The master barked commands, but his voice cracked with fear. The fire was faster than his power. It leapt from room to room, racing through curtains, across carpets, into rafters. The chandeliers melted, crashing down in showers of sparks. The proud mansion groaned like a beast in agony. Neighbors later said they saw the fire long before they heard the screams. The glow lit the horizon, a false sunrise blazing in the middle of the night. By the time riders arrived, the mansion was already engulfed, flames clawing high into the heavens, sparks raining down like meteors. They saw silhouettes stumbling out, a mistress clutching her children, a master coughing black smoke, a handful of servants collapsing onto the dirt. But they also saw figures slipping away into the shadows, fleeing toward the swamps. Not everyone who left the house was running for safety, some were running for freedom. For those still trapped inside, the fire was merciless. The grand staircase collapsed with a crash that shook the ground. Rooms crumbled inward, burying screams beneath burning timber. The paintings, the silks, the portraits of ancestors staring down in pride, all of it turned to ash. The wealth of generations disappeared in a single hour, consumed by the flame of a woman's vengeance. And yet, even in the fury, there was a strange silence within her. She did not cheer. She did not weep. She only breathed, steady and deep, as if exhaling centuries of stolen air. The fire spoke for her now. Its roar was her voice. Its light, her testimony. For the first time in her life, the master's world was burning, not hers. Dogs barked in the distance. Neighbors shouted. The plantation erupted into panic as the great house collapsed inward, sparks shooting into the sky like prayers finally released. But she did not look back. She turned toward the path leading into the woods, her body steady, her steps sure. Behind her, the inferno raged. Before her, the night stretched vast and uncertain. That uncertainty no longer frightened her. She had chosen this. Even if she were caught, even if she did not see another dawn, her act had already been written in fire. The mansion was gone. Its ashes would speak longer than any whip or chain. The night swallowed her as she slipped beyond the glow of the burning house. The forest loomed ahead, thick and dark, its silence broken only by the crackle of fire behind her and the distant cries of chaos. She moved quickly, not pausing to look back. Every instinct told her that hesitation meant death. Behind her, the mansion collapsed in waves of thunder, beams groaning, stone crashing, flames devouring the last remnants of the master's pride. It was the sound of an empire dying. She was not alone. Others had followed her, men, women, children from the quarters who had woken to the fire and realized what it meant. For years they had whispered of escape but never dared. Tonight, the fire gave them cover, and her courage gave them direction. She became their guide, leading them into the woods with urgency in her step, her face set with determination. For the first time, the chains of hesitation had broken. The swamps stretched before them like a labyrinth. Water pooled under cypress trees. Shadows moved with eerie quiet. But to them, this wilderness was safer than the plantation. Every splash of mud underfoot, every thorn snagging their clothes, was a reminder. They were free, at least for this moment. Behind them, the glow of the burning mansion lit the horizon, a beacon that would draw pursuers by morning. But tonight, in the cover of darkness, they pressed on. Fear stalked them at every step. Dogs could be unleashed. Patrols could ride out with lanterns and whips, searching the woods for runaways. The law itself was against them. Bounty hunters thrived on the capture of escaped slaves, dragging them back in chains for a reward. Every branch, crackling underfoot, made hearts race. Every owl's cry felt like a warning. But still, they moved forward, driven by something stronger than fear, the taste of possibility. The woman kept to the shadows, her eyes sharp. She had no map, but she had memory. She knew the bends of the river, the patches of swamp too deep to cross, the hidden paths others had whispered about in the quarters. She led them not just with her body, but with her resolve. If the fire had been her act of rebellion, this flight was her act of hope. She was not running blindly. She was carrying others toward a future they had only dared to imagine. Hours passed, the forest stretching endlessly. Children whimpered, elders stumbled, but no one turned back. They rested only briefly, crouched among the reeds, listening to the night. From a distance came the faint baying of dogs too far to see, but close enough to quicken their steps. The masters would not let such defiance go unanswered. Already, posses were gathering, their rage fanned by humiliation. They would hunt mercilessly. But the woman pressed onward, her voice low but firm. Keep moving. At dawn, the fire was still visible behind them, smoke rising like a black pillar into the sky. Neighbors from miles around would see it, would ride out in disbelief. The story would spread by morning. The great house had burned to the ground. Speculation would run wild. Some would whisper of an accident, others of God's wrath, and still others of rebellion. But among the enslaved, the truth would circulate quickly, carried in hushed tones. She did it. One of us burned the master's house. For those who escaped with her, survival was uncertain. Some might reach safe havens, joining maroon communities hidden deep in swamps or forests. Some might find their way north, risking capture but guided by secret networks of the Underground Railroad. Others might fall back into chains, caught by patrols, or betrayed by hunger and exhaustion. The future was fragile, but the act itself had already carved a place in memory. The fire was proof. Resistance was possible. The woman's fate remains a mystery. Some say she vanished into the wilderness, never seen again. Her name erased, but her legend alive. Others claim she was captured and executed, her body made into a warning for those who might follow. There are stories that she was burned alive by her captors, a cruel irony meant to extinguish her defiance. And yet, none of these endings matter as much as the fire she left behind. Her death, if it came, was not silence. Her act ensured she could never truly be forgotten. The masters rebuilt, as they always did, but they rebuilt on ash. Every new house carried the memory of the one that had burned. Every wealthy neighbor who passed by remembered the sight of flames consuming what they thought untouchable. And in their fear, they tightened their grip, passing harsher laws, enforcing stricter rules. But fear cannot erase memory, and memory cannot erase courage. For the enslaved who heard her story, she became a symbol. They spoke of her in whispers, passing her tale from one generation to the next. The woman who burned the mansion, the woman who turned suffering into fire, the woman who proved that even in chains, resistance was not only possible, it was inevitable. Her fire was not just destruction, it was creation. It created hope in hearts beaten down by centuries of cruelty. It created fear in the oppressors who realized their world was not invincible. And it created a legacy that would live long after the ashes cooled. The night she set the blaze, she did not know if she would survive. She did not know if her name would ever be spoken. But she knew one thing: she would not die a slave of silence. She would leave a mark, a scar on the world that had scarred her. And in the glow of that fire, her humanity shone brighter than the mansion ever had. By morning, the mansion was nothing but ruins. Black smoke curled into the pale sky, carrying the stench of charred wood and burned silk. What had once been a proud symbol of wealth now lay in a smoldering heap. Its grand staircase reduced to splinters, its chandeliers to molten puddles of glass. The ash still glowed red in places, as though the fire refused to die even in daylight. Neighbors arrived quickly, drawn by the sight of destruction. They reined in their horses, eyes wide, mouths tight with fear and anger. Plantation owners, who had spent their lives boasting of safety and order, now stared at the evidence of revolt. If one mansion could fall, so could another. If one woman could strike, so could others. The fire was not just an isolated act. It was a threat to their entire way of life. The master stood among the ruins, his face grey with soot, his pride shattered. He had survived, but survival was no victory. His house, his wealth, his very identity had been consumed in a single night. Worse still, whispers already spread that the blaze was no accident. Servants spoke in hushed tones, field hands exchanged glances, and neighbors muttered behind their hands. Everyone suspected the truth. Someone from within had lit the match. The search began immediately. Dogs were set loose, patrols rode out, and bounty hunters were summoned with promises of reward. The swamps became hunting grounds, the woods alive with the sound of shouts and barking. Every runaway was fair game, every shadow a potential fugitive. The woman who had led the act became the most wanted figure in the county, though few dared speak her name. Some whispered she had perished in the flames, others swore they saw her vanish into the trees. Either way, her defiance haunted them. Punishment came swiftly for those who remained. The enslaved who had not escaped were rounded up, questioned under the lash, forced to name names they did not know. Some were beaten, some killed outright, their bodies displayed as warnings. The message was clear: rebellion would not be tolerated. Fire would be answered with blood. The law sided with the masters, as it always did, granting them full authority to crush any whisper of defiance. Fear spread through the enslaved quarters of the region. Mothers hushed their children when they sang freedom songs at night. Men bowed their heads lower, speaking less, moving carefully. But beneath the fear, something else smoldered. The story of the fire traveled faster than the patrols. Word spread from plantation to plantation. A woman had burned her master's mansion to the ground. It was not just gossip. It was hope disguised as rumor. Hope that the masters were not untouchable. Hope that fire could answer the whip. Hope that courage could rewrite destiny. The white community, however, trembled in their own way. Though they clamped down with harsher rules, though they tightened their patrols, they could not erase the memory of that night. At every supper table, conversations turned uneasy. What if it happens here? They slept more lightly, ears attuned to every creak, every rustle. They eyed their servants with suspicion, wondering which silent face might harbor flames in their heart. The illusion of control was cracked, and no law could fully mend it. The master rebuilt eventually, as many did, a smaller house at first, then one grander, as if trying to erase the humiliation, but the scars remained. Neighbors remembered how he had stood among the ruins, helpless, and the enslaved remembered too, not his rebuilding, but his fall. Every lash he struck afterward carried less weight, for they had seen him burn. The woman's fate became legend. Some claimed she reached the swamps, joining maroon communities that survived by stealth, living in hidden villages where patrols dared not tread. Others believed she found her way north, guided by the secret paths of the Underground Railroad, her story passed on by abolitionists who used her act as proof of resistance. Still others whispered she had been caught, tortured, and executed, her body destroyed but her spirit unbroken. Each version carried its own power. The truth mattered less than the meaning. She had defied, and in defiance, she had become eternal. For the enslaved, the aftermath was heavy with grief. Those who had not escaped mourned friends, lost to punishment. Families were torn apart by suspicion, lives made harsher by fearful masters. But even as pain deepened, the story of the fire could not be erased. In secret gatherings, in whispered prayers, they remembered her as a beacon. Songs emerged that carried double meanings about light, about freedom, about a house consumed by flames. What the masters called terror, the enslaved called courage. History does not record the woman's name. No documents preserve her face, no portraits her likeness. She was never meant to be remembered, never meant to leave a mark. But fire does not ask permission to leave its trace. The ashes spoke where words could not, and every ember carried her story forward, across time, across silence, across the pages that refused to write her down. The punishment after the fire was brutal, but it could not undo what had been done. The masters rebuilt their houses, but they could not rebuild their invulnerability. The enslaved bent under harsher rules, but they bent knowing that bending was not the same as breaking. Something had shifted, something irreversible. The night a woman burned her master's mansion was the night the balance of fear changed, and though the chains remained, they no longer felt eternal. History often forgets the names of the oppressed. The voices of the enslaved were rarely written down, their stories buried beneath ledgers, property lists, and sermons justifying bondage. But sometimes, history remembers not through ink but through fire. The flames that consumed the mansion that night did more than destroy walls. They carved a place in memory that could not be erased. For the white community of the South, the story became a shadow that lingered for decades. Plantation owners rebuilt their houses, but they rebuilt with fear in their hearts. Every creak of the floor at night, every flicker of a candle too close to drapes, carried unease. They knew what they rarely admitted. The enslaved were not silent. They were watching, waiting, capable of striking in ways no wealth could fully prevent. The fire had revealed a terrible truth. Their power was fragile. But for the enslaved, the story was not terror. It was testimony. Around campfires, in whispered conversations, in the hymns sung late at night, her act became a seed of courage. If one woman could defy, perhaps others could too. If one mansion could burn, perhaps the system itself was not invincible. The memory of her fire joined the hidden archive of resistance alongside stories of runaways, of revolts, of Harriet Tubman leading her people through darkness, of Nat Turner rising with the sword. She stood among them, unnamed but unforgettable. Her fire also changed the language of survival. For centuries, enslaved people had resisted in quiet ways, breaking tools, feigning illness, singing coded songs. These were acts of defiance, subtle but real. Yet her act was not subtle. It was thunder in the night, undeniable and spectacular. It showed that resistance could be more than whispers. It could be a roar that lit up the sky. The fire also reshaped the moral imagination of those who later told the story. Abolitionists seized upon tales like hers, pointing to them as proof that slavery was not sustainable, not natural, not ordained by God. If it took chains, whips, and constant fear to maintain the system, then the system itself was doomed. The fire became a symbol not just of destruction, but of the inevitability of freedom's demand. You can silence a voice, but you cannot silence a flame. Generations later, when slavery had been abolished but injustice remained, her story still mattered. It mattered to sharecroppers who lived in poverty on the same land their ancestors once worked as slaves. It mattered to the freedom fighters of the civil rights era, who saw in her act a reflection of their own courage to resist. It matters still today, as we reckon with histories of oppression that linger in the soil and in our structures. Her fire asks us, what walls still stand that must be brought down? There is also a deeper, universal meaning in her act. The mansion she burned was not just wood and stone, it was a symbol of every system built on human suffering. It stood for arrogance, cruelty, and the illusion of permanence. By burning it, she revealed a truth that echoes across all ages. No structure of oppression lasts forever. Every empire has its night of fire. Every master's house meets its ashes. And what of her? Though we may never know her name, perhaps that anonymity is itself powerful. She could have been anyone. Any woman forced into servitude. Any person pressed under the weight of injustice. Her story belongs not just to her but to all who have resisted in silence, all who have dared to turn their pain into courage. She is not a figure of myth, but of possibility. She reminds us that within every ordinary soul lies the capacity for extraordinary defiance. For the descendants of those enslaved, her story is not merely history, it is inheritance. It is a reminder that their ancestors were not passive victims, but agents of their own destiny, however constrained. They resisted, they fought, they burned, they survived. And through survival, they gifted future generations not only life, but legacy. The fire was not only destruction, it was creation, birthing a story that could inspire long after the ashes cooled. As we remember her, we also confront ourselves. What fires must we light in our own lives, not of wood and cloth, but of truth and justice? What structures of cruelty still stand around us, demanding to be consumed? Her story is not just about a night long past. It is a mirror, reflecting the eternal struggle between chains and freedom, silence and defiance, fear and fire. The woman who burned her master's mansion may never have dreamed that her act would echo centuries later. She may have thought only of that night, of her own survival, of the freedom of those who fled with her. But history carries acts further than we ever imagine. Her fire leaps still, from her world into ours, from her courage into our questions. It reminds us that the most fragile thing in the world is oppression's illusion of permanence. And the most enduring thing in the world is the flame of human dignity. The fire is gone now. The mansion has long since crumbled into dust, its ashes scattered by rain, its wealth dissolved into history. The names of its masters are forgotten by most, their power reduced to brittle pages in old records. But the memory of the woman who dared to burn what enslaved her, endures. Her name may be lost, but her act remains, a flame carried through time. We began with a mansion, proud and untouchable, standing as a monument to cruelty disguised as civilization. We end with ruins, and with a question. What is remembered more, the house that stood, or the fire that consumed it? For generations of the enslaved, her story was not just destruction, it was inspiration. It was the proof that even the most ordinary among them could rise in extraordinary defiance. That even one spark, born of pain, could set alight the illusion of power. Her fire was not merely against a building, it was against a system. And though that system endured for a time, it too eventually fell, just as the mansion did. But her story is not only about the past, it speaks still to the present, to us who live in a world where new mansions are built, not of brick and wood, but of greed, oppression, and silence. We may not live under the same chains, but chains still exist. They take different forms, but they bind nonetheless. And her fire asks us, will you endure them quietly, or will you light the flame of resistance? The masters wanted her forgotten. They wanted the fire called an accident, the story erased, the courage buried. But history does not always obey. Her act outlived their silence. Her fire burned longer than their wealth, and every retelling of her story breathes life into the ember she left behind. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson. We may never control how history records us, but we can choose the mark we leave. She chose fire. She chose to leave behind not the memory of submission, but the memory of defiance. And in doing so, she became larger than her chains, larger than her master, larger even than her own name. So now, as we close this story, we are left with her flame flickering before us. It asks us to remember, it asks us to honor, and it asks us, in the silence of our own lives, when the world builds its house upon your suffering, will you endure in silence, or will you light the match? If this story touched you, let it not end here. Take a moment to reflect on the courage of a woman who refused to die in silence, and ask yourself what it means for us today. Her fire was more than history, it was a call to remember, to resist, and to hope. I invite you to keep that flame alive. Click the like button if this story spoke to your heart. Share your thoughts in the comments. What does her act mean to you? And what fire still burns within you? If you carry a prayer, a hope, or a memory of your own ancestors, share it so that others may draw strength. And if you wish to hear more stories like this, subscribe to this channel. Together, we can keep alive the voices that history tried to silence and carry their courage forward into our own time.